BCG has a long relationship with the Sutton Trust, and we enjoy working with them on some of their most important questions, and we were very happy to work on this question of vocational education. And what we try and do is we try and apply the same approaches that we would use in our private sector work to these important public sector problems. So we review the literature, we speak to the experts, in this case the academics, the public policy makers, and some of the writers of the key reports. We conduct quantitative analysis on the available data, and we benchmark as well. So we benchmarked, in this instance, the UK's vocational education system against other markets like Germany, Switzerland, Singapore, Australia, Austria, and various others. And I must say, and we also, by the way, benchmark against other industries. You know, what can you learn from the private sector in looking at some of these problems? And these types of projects are generally more interesting for us, actually, Lee, than advising chief executives in banks and energy companies. And with Peter Lample, we have a more demanding client, so that adds a bit of spice. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to just share with you some of the key findings that we concluded in this report, and maybe some thoughts about where some of the focus areas should be. I think issue number one related to the disconnect between quantity and quality of apprenticeships. In the UK, only 36% of apprenticeships are level 3 or higher, whereas that number in Germany is 90%. Or to look at it another way, in the UK, there are 6 quality apprenticeships for every 1,000 people in the population, whereas in Switzerland that number is 43. And we saw this when we went and visited some of these countries. We went with Peter and Lee and Connor and others, and we visited the Apprentice Training Centre in Switzerland, where we saw young people training as biology and chemistry technicians with state-of-the-art equipment, part funded by government and part funded by employers. So really a very different picture of a quality apprenticeship from what the stereotype might be. And we see an analogy with the private sector as well. Many of our clients in the private sector are no longer focused on the quantity of customers that they have. They're focused on the depth of the relationship they have with those customers. And so we feel the depth of relationship we have with these students as they follow through a vocational pathway is important. Quality over quantity. That was issue one. I think the second issue that we identified was, and this is well documented, the disconnect between the supply and the demand for skills, the equivalent of inventory shortages or stockpiles for our retail clients. And the well celebrated statistic, I think, is that for every one place that's needed in the economy for someone with a hair and beauty qualification, 5 people are qualifying, whereas it's the reverse for the STEM level qualifications, where there are 3 shortages for every 1 qualification. And we saw the contrast in a country like Germany when we went and visited Germany. We visited the Webasto organization, which is an auto parts company in Munich. And they actually have a firm target. They target that 7% of their workforce must be in apprenticeships at any point in time. So they're trying to address that mismatch between supply and demand and do so as part of the famous Duale system in Germany, which tries to solve for supply and demand. I think the third point that we identified was the complexity of the system. Again, I think some of these numbers are well documented, but there are over 18,000 vocational qualifications in the UK, and that number was 7,000 only 7 years ago. And there are over 150 awarding bodies in the UK, and that's doubled in the last 7 years. And this compares to 350 vocational qualifications in Germany, so 18,000 to 350. And that causes, not only does it cause complexity in delivery, but it causes confusion in consumption. We see this with our private sector clients. They are all looking to rationalise, to reduce the number of products that they offer, not just because it's expensive to deliver, but because it confuses customers. There was a famous experiment in supermarkets in the US where they looked at the way the supermarkets were selling jam. And on every second day, they sold 24 varieties of jam in a nice little pyramid, lots of different niche flavours. And every other day, they sold 6 varieties of jam, strawberry, blackberry, blueberry. And on the days they sold 6 varieties of jam, they sold 50% more jam than on the days they sold 24 varieties of jam, because I can't reject 23 varieties of jam. I don't know enough about jam to reject 23 varieties of jam, so I buy marmalade instead that day. And if you are offering 18,000 vocational qualifications, it's quite a confusing picture compared to a small number of qualifications for every type of speciality, which is what a country like Germany does. There are clearly many others more qualified than me that have identified this issue, like in the Wolf report, but it's clearly an issue that needs to be addressed. I think the fourth point that we saw, and it's been spoken about a lot this evening, is around the flexibility of the system and the incentives within the system, which lead to large amounts of dropout through the system. I think the figure is 31% dropping out at A-levels, because some of these students maybe aren't, it's not the right pathway for them. And we need to look at the way in which we're incentivizing the funding of courses and what's that doing to the student pathway, and also the reputational incentives, whether vocational education is seen on a par with parity of esteem to academic pathways. And when we look at other countries, it was mentioned this morning, the flexible pathways in Singapore, the bridges and ladder system, they also have been very proactive in marketing vocational education. They've had 4 major campaigns in the last 15 years, like the We Make You Shine campaign, to really try and achieve parity of esteem with academic education. In Australia, they have interplay between their certificate in education and their certificate in applied learning, where you're allowed to move back and forth between the two certificates. And again, we saw this in that Swiss college when we were speaking to the teachers. I remember one teacher said, I have 4 children, 2 of them are in universities and 2 of them are in vocational education. And that's quite standard. Whereas what we see in the UK is there's more clustering of educational approaches through different families. So trying to improve flexibility and trying to address some of those reputational incentives was an area that we identified. And then finally, we looked at the point of oversight and control. The skills sector councils, where if you look at their funding compared to the funding of equivalent bodies in countries like Germany, it's about 10%, and they are looking after 54 times the number of qualifications. So these are underfunded oversight bodies, and so it feels like in a world in which regulators are generally getting more funding and more teeth, we've been going in the opposite direction in education, and so trying to reinforce, reframe, and sharpen the focus of some of those bodies felt like an important step for us. So they were some of the issues we identified. Thankfully, we're not the first people to identify these issues. There have been many reports that we looked at and reviewed, like the Richer report that looked into supply and demand, the Wolf report that identified complexity and other issues, and she'll be speaking tomorrow, and clearly the Pearson research. And clearly there's lots being done. You know, it's not like this is a static question. There is much being done. There's the consultation on national colleges. There's increased funding for higher apprenticeships. There's considerable move to try and achieve parity of esteem. And we hear this morning that the principle of technical degrees has been announced. So thankfully lots is being done, and this is an area that seems to have grabbed the attention of the policymakers. Our sense is that a lot more needs to be done. And maybe I could just finish by highlighting 3 areas that we focused on in our report where we felt more needs to be done. One is on the question of quality and trying to reset the standard away from 1- and 2-year courses towards 3-year courses. You know, it's good that courses less than 12 months have now been deprioritised, have been rebadged, but we feel you need to push to a standard of 3-year courses, and we need to address the incentives in the student journey and the incentives for the schools themselves and the colleges themselves to try and move towards that 3-year standard. The second focus area or recommendation that we'd suggest would be just trying to improve the overall number of quality places. When we did the calculations, and we had lots of analysts trying to work this through, it felt that we needed another 300,000 quality apprenticeships in this country to close some of those gaps. And again, that has implications for funding, for how SMEs can participate in this, whether you can have pooled models, for how they are marketed to students students so that they'll participate. And then finally, on reinforcing the governance of all of this, on trying to improve the funding for the oversight bodies, trying to improve the employer involvement, which I know many others have recommended, and trying to sharpen their focus on vetting and reducing the number of qualifications. We did do some macroeconomic analysis on this, and our sense was that if you got all this right and you managed to close some of these skills gaps, the prize is big. We calculated £8 billion in GDP from improved productivity and £2.5 million from reduced costs to the public purse. So there's a big prize there in economic terms, but clearly there's an even bigger prize in terms of the impact that you have on the forgotten 50% and indeed, to the earlier point, on the remembered 50%. So I hope that's been a useful summary of some of the work we've done. I know there are people in the audience way more qualified than me to speak about this, and very happy to take any questions afterwards. Okay.